Judith Pierce ripped the charger from my wall and slammed my laptop onto the stone floor so hard, the crack sounded like something in this house finally admitting what it was. Her voice came right after it. Hot and certain. Calling me useless. Telling me a wife should be in the kitchen instead of hiding behind a screen while decent people worked. My demo window was still open on the broken display. Contract notes, frozen beside a half-shared deck. And that was what turned the shock in my chest into something sharp enough to move. I crossed the room before she could bend down again, caught her wrist as her heel scraped the tile, and shoved her back toward the hallway with my pulse pounding in my throat. She snapped that I had lost my mind, that Nolan would never let me put hands on his mother. And I opened the front door and pushed her onto the porch anyway. Nolan was already there when the cold air hit us, one hand still on his briefcase strap, looking from her to me like he had walked into a scene he recognized too well. He did not ask why his mother was in my office, or why my laptop was shattered at my feet. He only stared at me and said, "Ivy, apologize now." Judith clutched the porch rail and found her voice again, calling me unstable, swearing I had attacked her in her own son's home. And Nolan did nothing to stop that lie. I looked past them into the house I had paid for, at the office door still open behind us, at the blue light from my backup tablet blinking on the desk. That blinking light hit me before the humiliation did, because I knew exactly what it meant, and I turned back inside while Judith kept shouting my name across the porch. The demo had not fully dropped when she smashed the laptop, which meant the camera feed on my secondary device could still be live, still carrying her voice. The crash. Nolan's silence. I stepped into the office, saw the streaming panel still active, saw the view count climbing in real time, and understood that whatever they thought they controlled had just moved beyond this house. For 3 years, Nolan kept calling our living arrangement temporary, but temporary learned the floor plan, unpacked its opinions into every cabinet, and started correcting the temperature of my life. Judith inspected groceries, opened closets, lifted the lids off simmering pots, then drifted past my office door with that thin smile she wore whenever she wanted me to feel misplaced. Nolan would catch my hand under the table later, murmur that she was old-fashioned, that peace mattered more than pride, and ask me to let small things stay small. The problem was that nothing stayed small once it entered this house, because Judith treated every ordinary choice like evidence in a trial about whether I deserved to be here. If I ordered takeout on a late work night, she called it laziness. If I slept past 6 after closing a contract, she called it indulgence. And if I shut my office door, she called it secrecy. Nolan never repeated her worst lines, but he made room for them by sanding down my reactions, telling me I was stronger than this, which only meant he expected me to absorb what he refused to stop. The blue light still blinking on my backup tablet mattered because it sat in the office I had built, inside the house I had purchased with early profits before Nolan ever touched a mortgage application. Judith liked to speak as if I had landed softly in her son's life, but the deed carried my name. The tax notices came to me, and the renovation invoices had cleared through my accounts. I had spent 2 years living like a guest inside property I owned, listening to a retired woman call my work pretend, while her son accepted the comfort my company financed. When the clip started spreading, strangers saw the pattern faster than I had let myself name it. Because the broken laptop, Nolan's silence, and Judith's voice formed a complete sentence. They were not reacting to one ugly afternoon. They were reacting to a woman getting erased in her own home, while the man beside her translated that erasure into manners. Standing in my office with the live panel still running, I realized my marriage had not been worn down by misunderstanding. It had been arranged, day after day, until I would mistake shrinking for love. My phone lit up with Gavin Rhodes before I could even answer the flood of messages. And when I picked up, he skipped sympathy and went straight to ownership. He asked why Nolan Pierce appeared in an internal cap table memo tied to a limited economic interest. And for one long second, I thought he had the wrong company. I had known Nolan liked to hover near my wins, liked to mention introductions and market access, but I had never given him authority, equity, or permission to stand inside my business. I called Brooke Talbot while the live clip kept spreading, and 10 minutes later she was inside my inbox, my document room, and every signature trail I had been too busy to distrust. She found the first fracture in a side letter routed through an advisory structure. Then the second in a disclosure thread Nolan had answered with language so careful it sounded rehearsed. By the time Brooke read the name Celeste Avery out loud, I already felt that ugly click inside my chest. The one that comes when confusion finally gives way to pattern. Celeste had shown up twice months earlier as a growth strategist attached to exploratory conversations. Polished, forgettable, almost too professional to leave an emotional stain. Brooke pulled the archived calendar holds, matched them to Nolan's private dinner receipts, then opened an email where Celeste wrote that pressure clarifies leadership and instability exposes founders. Another thread followed it, cooler than the first, suggesting they capture the reaction if I melted down on camera, which turned Judith's outburst from a family humiliation into a tactic. That was the moment the affair stopped being the worst part. Because betrayal is ugly enough on its own, but strategy wrapped around betrayal leaves a cleaner kind of damage. Nolan had not just let his mother treat me like dead weight. He had let Celeste map me as a risk variable, then stepped quietly into my company through a hidden economic foothold. Judith had provided the noise, the smashed machine, the familiar cruelty. But behind her stood two people trying to manufacture founder instability and call it governance. I sat there with Brooke on speaker and Gavin waiting for an answer, staring at the broken laptop, the active stream log, and the side letter Nolan had never once put in my hands. The facts lined up too neatly to argue with them. Nolan's concealed interest, Celeste's emails, Judith entering my office during a live demo, and his first instinct on the porch being protect the scene. Not me. When I finally spoke, I did not ask whether he had cheated or lied. I asked Brooke to preserve every file. Because whatever this marriage had been, it was no longer confusion. It was structure. I did not post a crying video, write a thread, or try to win strangers one comment at a time. Because the broken laptop, the active stream log, and Celeste's emails had already given me something better. Brooke told me to stop touching anything except through copies, so I sat at my dining table and built a clean record from the exact order things had happened. First came the clip of Judith tearing the charger free and smashing my machine, then the demo timestamp, then the streaming panel, then Nolan's concealed side letter, then Celeste's line about capturing my reaction. Once those 5 pieces sat in one folder, the story they told no longer needed my anger to hold it together, which was the first thing that made me feel steady again. Brooke flagged 3 problems immediately, not as abstract legal language, but as plain damage with signatures attached, concealed conflict, reputational manipulation, and coordinated interference around a live business event. Gavin answered my email within minutes. And the speed of that response told me something Nolan never had, that the people with real money cared less about family optics than documented risk. Nolan tried to reach me before the formal review could start. Knocking once on my office door like courtesy still belonged to him after everything I had just uncovered. When I opened it, he stepped into the room slowly and started with the same measured voice he used whenever he wanted control to sound like reason, saying this had gotten bigger than it needed to be. I turned my screen toward him and left Celeste's email open between us, the one about pressure revealing leadership, and asked whether he wanted a backup plan for the company or a replacement for me. His jaw tightened before he answered, which mattered more than the answer itself, because the hesitation landed right beside the side letter and made the same shape. He told me I was making this personal, as if the woman in his inbox, the stake in my company, and the smashed machine on my office floor belonged to separate worlds. I did not raise my voice. I only slid the second printout beside the first, the text where he told Judith not to apologize to me on camera, and watched his face lose the calm he had walked in wearing. That was when I stopped needing explanations. Because every time I put another document in front of him, he looked less like a husband caught in a mess and more like a man caught in his own design. Brooke sent the preservation notice while he was still standing there. Gavin scheduled the emergency review, and I uploaded the package exactly as instructed. No speeches, no adjectives, no room left for interpretation. By the time Nolan left the doorway, I understood the cleanest kind of retaliation was not public outrage. It was closing every exit inside the paperwork before he realized the building had already locked behind him. The emergency review opened that night with Gavin Rhodes already on screen. 2 investors beside him. Counsel, present. And Nolan seated across from me like proximity could still pass for standing with me. Judith stayed in the living room within earshot, close enough to catch fragments, still certain this was a family dispute that would collapse if she stayed loud long enough. I did not begin with the marriage, the affair, or the humiliation on the porch, because Brooke had been right. The cleanest case starts with what can be timed, logged, and verified. So I walked them through the order exactly as it happened. The live demo, the charger ripped free, the laptop breaking on stone, the secondary stream still active, the public clip, the side letter. Gavin stopped me only once to confirm whether the stream timestamp matched the internal product presentation record, and when I said yes, counsel answered before Nolan could. Then Celeste's emails went up beside the cap table memo, and the room changed in the quiet way rooms do, when everyone understands the damage before anyone speaks it aloud. Nolan tried to narrow it back down to a domestic blow-up, telling them his mother had acted emotionally, that the internet had distorted everything, that I was letting private pain bleed into business. Brooke did not argue with his tone. She only directed everyone to the message where he told Judith not to apologize to me on camera and to the thread where Celeste suggested they capture my reaction. That was the moment the second viral wave began outside the call, because someone had already stitched the clip to those receipts. And the story online stopped being wife loses control and became husband and consultant, planned the pressure. I watched Nolan read the same shift on his phone in real time. Watched the color leave his face as the narrative he thought would bury me turned and fixed on him instead. Gavin leaned forward and kept his voice level when he asked whether Nolan had disclosed his personal relationship with Celeste before participating in any discussion tied to my company's growth or governance. Nolan answered too late and too carefully, and that hesitation landed harder than a denial, because every document already sitting on screen had prepared the room for exactly that silence. From the living room, Judith burst in at the word planned, outraged that strangers were judging her family. But no one in the call cared about her outrage once the records had already made her role legible. She had smashed the laptop. Yes, but the texts, the side letter, and Celeste's emails had stripped her of the power to pretend she was the whole story. Gavin moved to the decision without drama, freezing Nolan's rights pending review, suspending any expansion path touching Celeste, and sending the matter to counsel while I closed my screen and finally felt the room tilt back toward truth. By morning, the damage had split into separate lanes, and each lane carried a different name, a different file, and a consequence none of them could hide inside family language. Nolan's bank placed him on internal review before breakfast, not because our marriage was collapsing, but because the side letter, the undisclosed relationship, and the governance exposure had all reached his employer at once. Celeste lost her largest upcoming contract by noon, and the withdrawal email named conflict concerns so plainly that even her polished brand could not soften what she had turned herself into. Judith tried to drag everything back into her preferred shape, pacing my kitchen and calling it betrayal that I had let outsiders humiliate her son over a private matter. But there was nothing private left once the texts, the stream log, and the advisory trail had already named what each of them had chosen to do. She had smashed the machine. Nolan had hidden the interest. Celeste had framed the pressure. And none of it became smaller just because Judith kept calling me cruel. Brooke separated everything cleanly after that. Business review in one lane. Marital dissolution in another. Occupancy and property rights in a third. Which was the first time the house felt orderly again. The title was mine. The operating control was mine. Nolan's interest was limited and frozen. And Judith had no independent right to stay once Brooke served notice. I read that notice at the counter while Judith stared at me like I had switched languages on her. Then I set it down between us and told her she had been calling this her son's house for too long. Nolan sat at the table through most of it with the look men wear when consequences stop sounding theoretical and start taking the shape of boxes, signatures, and doors. He asked once, quietly, whether I was really going to let this go all the way. And I looked at the paperwork spread between us and answered that it already had. Judith packed before sunset. Nolan stayed longer. And for the first time since I married him, I crossed my own house without feeling watched, corrected, or reduced. A week later, Brooke finished the buyout draft, and Nolan signed it without bargaining because every page in front of him carried the same message he could no longer outrun. His limited interest returned to me at a loss. His review remained open, and the only leverage he had once imagined disappeared into signatures, initials, and dated acknowledgments. I watched him write his name where Brooke marked the lines, and it struck me that the same hand which hid a foothold in my company was now using ink to surrender it. That should have felt like revenge, but it did not, because revenge still keeps the other person at the center. And by then I was exhausted with orbiting men who confused access with ownership. What I felt instead was the clean quiet that came after proof had done its work. After the side letter, the texts, and Celeste's emails had finished speaking for me. Nolan looked up once and asked whether this was really what I wanted. And I answered with the only truth left worth saying, that I wanted my life returned to its proper owner. After he left Brooke's office, I went home and started changing practical things first. Because practical things were what had been used to shrink me in the first place. I replaced the broken laptop, updated every lock code, cleared the shared passwords, and took down the handwritten notes Judith had left near the stove like tiny laws. One of them still said Nolan likes dinner hot, and I stood there holding that scrap of paper until it finally looked as small as it had always been. Gavin confirmed the next funding conversation was still moving. Not out of pity, but because pressure had exposed the company and I had not folded, which mattered more than any apology ever could. The market had seen the clip, then the receipts, then the review, and the sequence had done something Nolan and Celeste never planned for. It made my steadiness legible. I spent that afternoon at my dining table rebuilding the week they had tried to fracture. Calendar open. Contracts aligned. My own breathing finally matching the pace of the room, Nolan came back once for the last of his things. Quieter than I had ever known him. Carrying a box he filled without asking where anything belonged. At the door, he stopped and asked whether I had ever loved him at all. And I looked past his shoulder at the office he had tried to enter through paperwork and answered that I loved the man I thought he was. The real one had stood on my porch while his mother smashed my work, hidden his interest in my company, and let another woman diagram my collapse like a business opportunity. He left with that, and the house did not feel haunted afterward, which surprised me more than his betrayal ever had, because I had expected grief to be louder. Instead, there was only space, and in that space I could hear every compromise I would never make again, each one tied to something concrete they had done. I did not win because I ruined them. I won because I no longer needed anyone's permission to live, work, speak, or stay exactly as large as I already was. Thank you for staying with me through this story and holding space for the part of me that finally learned peace does not ask permission. If any piece of this felt familiar, I hope you find a love that feels safe, steady, and fully yours one day soon. For real.